It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here on behalf of President Rabinowitz and the entire university. Today is really a magnificent day. First of all, today is what we call our Day in the Pride. It is a day when we invite all members of our community to show their delight and pride in being part of the Hofstra Pride. So all day today, if you look on social media, you will see photographs of our students, our faculty, our administration, and staff showing what they do, going about their day every day to make Hofstra a special place, which makes it an absolutely perfect day for today's symposium in honor of the 25th anniversary of our oldest international exchange program, our exchange with the University of Amsterdam. We are extraordinarily proud of this relationship. Hofstra has grown from its roots in 1935 to a very small commuter local institution serving Long Island to an organization, a university that takes Long Island to the world and brings the world to Long Island. The earliest and most substantial part of our efforts to internationalize Hofstra University are represented by our 25-year-old exchange with the University of Amsterdam. In those 25 years, we have exchanged 250 students, and we find that when we talk to students on both sides of the exchange, these relationships are rich, they're deep, they expand the horizons, not only of the individuals, but of everyone with whom those individuals come in contact. They are a way that Hofstra opens itself up from our location in one of the most diverse parts of the United States to the Netherlands, and particularly Amsterdam, one of the most international and universal cities in Europe and on this globe. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome some leaders from the Netherlands and from the University of Amsterdam. The leaders of our two universities have put together a short video to show you some of the important conversations and dialogues that are inspired by our exchange program. And so without further ado, I'm happy to introduce that video.
What is important to us, and even more day by day, is that this international skills, this international experience is so important for young people in this world which is completely globalized.
Because the world is getting smaller and smaller. I know that sounds like an adage, but it's a true one. And there's hardly any field of endeavor that you go into, even if you think you're going to be in the middle of America, where you don't have connections with and have to deal in some manner with people from all over the world. And to have an experience abroad as a student teaches you the importance of differences in culture and language and so on. To me, it's a no-brainer.
We have been investing in international partnerships already for many years, and your university, Hofstra University, was one of the early partners that we had at that time, and we are very proud about that. And then, of course, your university being in the US, we have, of course, a common heritage, which is also very close to our heart.
Just like the same reason we strive for racial diversity and economic diversity, geographic and cultural diversity adds a tremendous amount to the educational opportunities of an American student.
We realize that when people from these youngsters from abroad come here, that it's an experience for them. So we try to do a very good soft landing so that they, from day one, are part of a larger community, meet people, meet also people from the university. And then, of course, Amsterdam is a beautiful city where a lot more can be done than only study, and I do believe that's also important for these youngsters and their development and education.
University of Amsterdam has a great reputation, and not only as an institution of higher learning, but a mecca for students from all over the world. So that students who go to the University of Amsterdam program get to meet not just people from Holland, but also people from all over the world.
For me, it's important, even if this is Dutch people who will do work the rest of their lives in the Netherlands, then this international experience, and especially also this experience at Hofstra University, is very important. I'm convinced that this is something that they bring back to the Dutch society and to us, and I think it's extremely important. And I do hope, of course, that they also bring something to you.
I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank Melissa Connolly and her team from University Relations who helped to produce that video. So now, on behalf of both universities, I would now like to recognize the presence here today, first of all, of the Consul General of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Dolf Hogewoning. And Senior Policy Officer Vera Kuipers. Now I'd like to ask the Director of Alumni Relations for the University of Amsterdam, Carolyn Weaver, along with Neil Donahue, the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Academic Affairs and Internationalization, to come forward and accept a gift, a symbolic gift, on behalf of Hofstra University to the University of Amsterdam, in recognition of our 25 years of cooperation and in anticipation of more than 25 more. Thank you. I understand that in the box is actually an original Hofstra women's scarf that
I'll give it to the director. Director Magnificus would have loved to be here, but she couldn't come. And she asked me, because I was here for alumni meetings, to give you this present, prints from university buildings of the University of Amsterdam.
And I will pass these along to President Rabinowitz. He will be delighted.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I think it's Neil Donahue's turn.
Thank you. So, thank you, Dr. Simmons. So it's my pleasure to introduce now Russell Shorto. Russell Shorto is an award-winning author of numerous fascinating books, two of which, however, make him the obvious choice for any celebration of transatlantic exchange involving New York and Amsterdam, as we are doing here today. His work of 2004, The Island at the Center of the World, the epic story of Dutch Manhattan and the founding colony that shaped America, brought to life the first generations of European settlement by the Dutch in New Netherland and New Amsterdam, roughly speaking, New York State and New York City, but not only, and brought to light the ethos of multicultural tolerance that arose here out of the Dutch commercial instincts and came to define the spirit of both New York and the United States, opposite perhaps New England Puritanism. His vivid narrative drew upon newly discovered documents from that time, translated and contextualized by colleagues at the New Netherland Institute and Research Center in Albany, who are also in attendance here today and will have a session at 3 p.m. Shorto completed the equation of transatlantic exchange then with a book entitled Amsterdam, A History of the World's Most Liberal City in 2013, that explains the links of landscape to that city's role in the rise of Enlightenment learning, invention, and exploration of the 17th century, fueled by both enterprising spirit and exploitative colonialism abroad, and at home, tolerance of other peoples and beliefs. In telling history, or historical stories, Shorto illuminates broad, complicated contexts through concrete particularities, compelling characters, and dramatic episodes. Shorto is, in sum, a narrative historian whose works combine the historian's love of fact with an archaeologist's instinct for eloquent artifact, an anthropologist's grasp of cultural context, and a novelist's grasp of detail, personal drama and psychology, and overall narrative arc or plot. As in his book, another one of my favorites of his, Descartes' Bones, A Skeletal History of the Conflict Between Faith and Reason in 2008, or now in his stunning new book, which is on sale, and he'll be willing to sign afterwards, Revolution Song, A Story of American Freedom from 2017. It's his longest book and his shortest title, and brings together 6 different biographical perspectives on the American Revolution. Again, Shorto, the novelistic historian, gives the texture of lived experience in other times and places, and by so doing, he communicates understanding, and through understanding, tolerance of different viewpoints. Like the Dutch culture he has explored for himself and explained so well to others. With our partners at the University of Amsterdam, we're delighted now to welcome him to Hofstra in celebration of our Dutch heritage and those values, and in the spirit of cultural exchange. Please join me in welcoming Russell Shorto.
Thank you very much, Neil, for your generous introduction. I was once introduced by someone who said, here's someone who needs no introduction. And we all sat there in stunned silence because, of course, I needed an introduction. Nobody knew who I was. Thank you to Hofstra University. Thank you to the University of Amsterdam, and in particular to Neil Donahue for putting together this marvelous day and for inviting me to be here. It's truly an honor. Neil and I worked out the title and subtitle of my talk, and we came up with The Flow of Influence as a subtitle because I'm going to talk about New York, the New York region, the Dutch colony of New Netherland with its capital of New Amsterdam, and I'm going to talk about Dutch history, and it's ultimately going to be all about water, hence the idea of the flow of influence. And I gave a kind of warm-up to this talk earlier this week, and I only got about 2/3 of the way through it before my time was up. So I apologize in advance if I'm going to start speaking fast, because I'd like to get through a lot of it. I have a lot of images and a lot of ground to cover, and I'm going to start here. The metaphor of an acorn and an oak tree comes to my mind often when I look at this image. You know, these two things couldn't be more different, an acorn and an oak tree, and yet they're genetically the same. So this is the acorn to New York City's oak tree. This is New Amsterdam, circa 1660. And I will come back to it and talk about it in more detail. This is the place that the Dutch founded, which grew into New York City. This is the southern tip of Manhattan Island. So here on the left side is the southern tip. You see along the right side the wall that became Wall Street, and I have used this projection, this map, to give tours in Lower Manhattan in the financial district. You can use it and walk around, still the street pattern of the financial district. And maybe the most notable thing about it is how organized it looks. The rap on the Dutch colony in the English period was that, you know, the Dutch sort of muddled around there, and then the English took over, and then they made it New York, and then it really got going. You can see this was a very organized place. The colony was organized with careful attention to it. That you can see they even made a canal because they were Dutch and they had to have a canal. And there are, I think, 352 houses here. We know the names of all the owners. There was a census taken at the same time, so it was a very organized place. All right, now, from here, I'm going to jump to Europe in the Middle Ages, because that's where the Dutch story really begins. The Netherlands, for the most part, is not ancient. It's not like Rome or Greece. It's really a place that begins in the Middle Ages. And if I just say Europe in the Middle Ages, I think any sensible person would have one particular image that comes to mind. For the students who are here, I have learned that students, sadly, and this says something about the failure of the educational system, often don't even know what Monty Python was. But this is Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is a very accurate representation of Europe in the Middle Ages, and in particular of what was called the manorial system. So the manorial system, which was kind of the building block of much of Europe in the Middle Ages, was a system whereby you had a manor, which is a great chunk of land, and that land was controlled by a nobleman who lived in a castle. And there were all kinds of people who lived and worked on that land under him, farmers and wheelwrights and carpenters and lawyers and scribes and all kinds of people. And they all owed fealty to this nobleman, and he, in turn, provided protection. So this system, and the system went on and on for hundreds of years, and it was a fixed system, and that meant that wherever you were born into in that system, your children and your grandchildren would be would occupy that same rung. And it's based on the land. This system did not really take hold in what became the Netherlands because of land, because that corner of Europe was, it's essentially a vast river delta. 3 of Europe's major rivers drained to the sea there, which meant it was very unstable, and that was why it was settled later than other places. So when I first went to the Netherlands, I knew that they had these things called polders, that much of the land was reclaimed from the sea. But when I went out into the countryside, I was looking for, where are the polders? I don't see them. I don't see them here. I don't see them here. Well, it turns out that it's kind of hidden. You have to know what you're looking for. So in this case, the road is running on top of a dike. You build a dike, and then then you reclaim land, you develop land, and here the land on both sides is a polder. It's reclaimed from the sea. Similarly here, the houses and the road are built on a dike, and it's kind of hard to tell, but the water on the right is actually or higher than the ground on the left. So that is reclaimed land. If you compare a map of that part of Europe in the Middle Ages with today, there's more than 40% more land there now than there was. The Dutch have a saying, God made the earth, but the Dutch made Holland. And they mean it literally. They actually made their land. And in doing that, then contrast that with what I started by talking about, the manorial system. Once they made land in every municipality, they divided it up. It wasn't owned by the church or a king. It was theirs. So individuals in each town became landowners, and they began buying and selling from each other their land, and they began using the land to graze cattle, to grow crops, and they got wealthy. And when they did, they realized they could make life better for their children than it had been for them. And this, I think, kind of flipped a switch in the Dutch mentality that made them different from other Europeans. It made them innovators, it made them entrepreneurs, it made them open to innovation, to looking for innovation. This is the Netherlands. When you come from this country and you go there, you have to look for it, and when you see it, you realize that this is a really manufactured landscape. So let me take you quickly through a little bit how this process worked. This is a river. This is a situation in maybe 1200 AD or so. So you need to control the water. You need to control the water so that it doesn't, what happens otherwise is when the spring comes, things flood, the land that you had planted the previous year is suddenly underwater, your house is flooded. So you build up here dikes along the riverbank, and then the houses are safely on top of or behind the dikes. You build a dam down here at the bottom. So this is the Amstel River, and that's the dam. The Amstel Dam is where the city of Amsterdam gets its name. And then the houses are protected, and then you dig those trenches, and that drains the water from this low land, so then you can use the land. So this is the situation of Amsterdam. This is an artist's rendering around 1200 AD. This is basically the same spot about 3.5, 4 centuries later. This is Dam Square, which was also featured in that video we just showed, in the 1600s at the height of the Dutch Golden Age. So that dam at the bottom here is where the people are now standing on. You see over on the right, you can see some ships' masts. So that's the river that continues down to the open water. Here's the same place today, or recently when the circus was in town. So this massive area where all the people are, that's the dam. And then the road that juts off to the right is now built over what was the end of the river as it goes into the eye, as it's called. And this is the same spot looking now down what was the river. So this is what happens over time. This is how, in a few slides, how the Netherlands developed from the Middle Ages to today. So when they did this, when these Dutch people used this kind of innovative impulse, they quickly built up a society unlike any other in Europe. They developed the East India Company, which was the greatest company in the history of the world up to that point, which exploited the world in ways that nobody ever imagined. This is the director of the East India Company operations in Batavia, in what's now Indonesia, and he's proudly pointing at, he and his wife, and they're proudly pointing at the water and the ships and, you know, all that they have. This is the East India Company outpost in Bengal in India. And so by the 1600s, I'm talking about a story that begins a few centuries earlier than that. By the 1600s, this massive innovation that's going on allows, through the main vehicle of the East India Company, for this massive wealth to come into the Dutch cities. And this is Amsterdam. This is the iconic canals of Amsterdam, the iconic canal houses, which I think are remarkable in so many ways. One having to do with what a house is. Among many other innovations that the Dutch at that time is their notion of a home. The writer Witold Rybaszynski wrote a great book called Home, A Short History of an Idea, in which he talks about our modern concept of a home as a place of intimacy and, you know, domestic intimacy coming from the Dutch canal houses. So if you think of other parts of Europe in the Middle Ages, in Rome or Paris, a house was this big complex structure, and, you know, maybe it would have a courtyard that you could ride your horse into, and there was maybe many generations of a family, and renters and servants and animals and all kinds of things. Each of these, in contrast, was built for a man and his wife and their children. And what they would do, since there were many of them entrepreneurs, they would have their operation on the stoop level, the first floor, and that would be where the man's office was, where he would meet, have business meetings. And the family quarters would be behind there, and then on the upper floors. And on the top floor was the attic where you'd store things. You can see along the tops are what are called hoist beams. They have a hook on the end, and these are built on the canal. And again, everything is about water. So you could travel, one of these men could have traveled all the way to the East Indies to oversee the purchase of spices, for example, come all the way across the world on the ships, transfer in the harbor to a smaller ship, and the ship would take your goods right up to your door, and then the hoist beam would hoist them up into your attic, and you would store them there, and you could sell them from there. So you see how they reshape their cities and their identity around this notion of basically exploiting the world and looking for innovation. So many other facets of what we think of as modern are developed in the Dutch Republic at this time. This is a portrait by Rembrandt of a furniture maker. He's not a well-known person, but every one of these portraits that Rembrandt painted, every one of these people has a Wikipedia page. You know, they're all famous in some way, not because they did great things, but because they were part of that generation, that first generation of people who were beginning to be modern the way we are. They began to think of themselves as individuals. And this, again, goes back to what I was talking about with this relationship to the water and how it spurs this individual sense, this individual, he became wealthy. You had to be to be able to afford to have Rembrandt paint your portrait. So each one of these individuals in Amsterdam is able, in a new way, to see themselves as individuals. So Rembrandt paints him and paints his wife, and that's what they did. They lined up to have their portraits painted. So Dutch art in the period takes this turn to the secular, but also to the individual and to the ordinary. And you have to think that art, for the most part at the time, was still biblical paintings, and their clients were churches. The Dutch and foreign travelers, when they went to Amsterdam and other Dutch cities, they would be perplexed to see in the market, like on Dam Square, you would have a vegetable dealer and a fish seller, and then you would have someone selling canvases, selling paintings, and the people buying the paintings were ordinary people, and what the paintings depicted were ordinary people doing ordinary things. So to us, this is normal, but then it was something new, and the Dutch really pioneered it. In short, I think what the Dutch pioneered in the 17th century, and what they developed, and as I kind of shift to talk about New York, two things. And this slide represents one of them, and that was the Dutch approach to free trade. Everything I've been talking about, how water kind of set this all in motion, led them to become traders, which meant inventors in many cases. You're looking for new models, new ways of new kinds of ships to build, new products, and new innovations in business. This is the world's first stock exchange in Amsterdam. In that earlier slide, I showed you the Amstel River with the dam. The dam is down kind of at the bottom here, and the river, you see the boat there, the river actually goes right under the stock exchange in the open waters back there. So they built the stock exchange as this, really at the place where the city and the harbor, therefore the city and the world kind of meet. And so that's where they built that. And along with the stock exchange came the concept of shares of stock and things like short selling and all these devices for manipulating finance. And the other innovation which plays into the founding of New York is tolerance, which particularly meant religious tolerance. The Dutch in the 17th century and earlier in the 16th century were fighting a war of independence against Spain. The Dutch provinces had been controlled by Spain. They were pulling away. Spain resisted. Spain sent the Inquisition in, this bloody series of assaults because the Dutch War of Independence, as the Dutch were pulling away from Spain, the Dutch Protestantism was taking over. And so this war had a strong religious character. And partly out of this turmoil comes this Dutch notion of toleration, of religious tolerance, which does not mean celebrating diversity or anything like that. It was very restrictive, but it was a watershed. And this is the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, which was the largest synagogue in the world at the time. Jews were not treated like every other ordinary citizen. It was almost a kind of apartheid situation. You had a separate sphere, but this slide is representation, an illustration of the fact that tolerance meant something. That while in England, for example, they would be burning people as witches for not having the same religious beliefs. In Dutch cities, the Catholics were allowed to have churches, but they had to be kept hidden. So the tolerance was a restricted thing, but it was a real thing. Okay, now I'm back to New Amsterdam. This is, I showed you that kind of map image to start. This is a painting of the same scene of New Amsterdam we're at Brooklyn looking across. And all of these features, again, it's very identifiable. You can see the fort back there, the windmill, and on the right, that white building standing kind of by itself was the city tavern. And then when the city won its charter, municipal charter, that became the first city hall. So in other words, while the Dutch are building this golden age of Rembrandt and art and science, and the Dutch Republic became the global center of publishing, while the East India Company is sending its ships all around the world, they found this colony based in the New World with its capital of New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. And the colony encompassed all or parts of 5 future states: New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, part of Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And they made maps. And this is one of those maps. And I could talk for an hour just about this map. There's so much packed in here. I promise I won't. But this map, there were many, many iterations. It was so good for more than 100 years, from the 1650s and well into the 1700s. The English used it. You can tell this version is from the English period because it says, first it says Nova Belgica, which is the Latin for New Netherland, and then it says Nieuw Nederland, and then it says New York in funny spelling. So this tells you, this is after 1664, after the English had taken over. They were still using the map, and still it was this fuzzy moment when, is this New Netherland, or is it New York, or is it both? So this is one representation of their colony. This is a little bit of a blow-up of the map. We are down here at Long Island, which the Dutch named. Up here, Fort Orange is where the Dutch built the colony. Part of the colony, its money-making business was in trading for furs with the natives, and they would natives would bring, where'd my pointer go? Bring furs down the Mohawk River, and the Dutch would trade with them there, and then they would pack them onto ships and bring them down what became the Hudson River to Manhattan here, and then from there they would be sent off to Europe. And furs were very valuable, beaver in particular, very valuable commodity in Europe. You can see from the map, I mean, all these place names and things. So they had this notion, I mean, looking at this, and when you're a writer, you're a historian, you're always trying to understand what was it like? What was this moment in history like? And so what I am able to do here, there's a sort of a posse here from the New Netherland Institute in Albany that you'll hear from later today, and they're going to talk in some detail about the Dutch records. One member of that who's not here today is actually an artist, Len Tantillo, who it works the way a historian works to uncover documents and information in documents, but what he does with it is then puts them into historical paintings. So, and he was nice enough to allow me to use a few of his images. So if you look at all these little waterways here coming off the inlets that flow into the Hudson, Len has given us an idea of what civilization looked like at this time. This is one of his paintings, and this is an inlet from the Hudson River, and I think he puts this at 1645, and I think he dates that because he knows that that particular type of ship was recorded as being there at that time. He studies the exact nature of the Dutch architecture of the farm and the outlying buildings. So this helps for me to give you a sense of what, this Amsterdam is building, as I showed you in some of those paintings. It's this magnificent urban center. This is New Netherland. This is another one of his paintings. This is the ferry landing at Fort Orange in what's now Albany. And this is his version of that scene of New Amsterdam looking from Brooklyn at the city. And then the next one, he actually gets kind of on the ground. And this is Hanover Square, just north of what was New Amsterdam. So this is just outside the city limits of New Amsterdam. The wall was the northern extent of the city. So this helps me to get a feeling, and again, he researches very carefully all the the buildings, and he knows the kinds of cows they had and everything, to give you that flavor of what the city, what the place was like. My book, The Island at the Center of the World, I write narrative history, which to me means people in conflict in their time. And so what I spent a long time with the records of the colony and working with Charlie Gehring and Janni Venema, who have been translating and publishing the records since the 1970s. And, but I was looking for, you're kind of swimming in documents and in just raw data, and I was looking for a kind of spine, a narrative spine. And then finally, I decided that my narrative spine would be the struggle between these two men who were both members of the colony of New Netherland. The one on the left is Peter Stuyvesant, who was the last and the greatest director of the colony. And the man on the right is Adrian van der Donck, who was appointed as the representative of the populace. So Stuyvesant worked for, he was an official of the Dutch West India Company that founded this colony as a money-making enterprise. And so he tried to exercise those duties. For whatever combination of reasons, the people who lived in the colony were putting down roots, they were intermarrying, they were doing all the things you do when you're developing a society, and they wanted more of the rights and freedoms and privileges from home, from the Dutch Republic. So they didn't want to be just working at a company outpost. So this struggle begins, and they appoint van der Donck, who was the only lawyer in the colony, to represent them. And so the struggle between the two men over this colony and what it could become is the way I tell the story of New Netherland in my book. I'm going to quickly go over a few of the records, and again, this is the main way that you recreate this moment of history. This is maybe the most famous document from the colony. This is the so-called Peter Schagen letter. And this is, in effect, New York City's birth certificate. This is a letter, they would send goods, like furs, to Europe, and there would be an official on the dock there who would write down, okay, this ship just arrived, and here's what's on it. So this official, Peter Schagen, you see his name at the bottom, he writes, you can see he says, "Het eiland Manhattan" there. So this ship has just arrived from the island of Manhattan. And you see the 60 there, 60 guilders. This is the famous rendering of the purchase, where he says, our people have just purchased the island from the natives for the value of 60 guilders. And he says, some women have given birth there, so we're starting to have a society. This is in 1626. You see the date down there. And then here he lists different kinds of animal furs that were on the ship. So this is the indication of, because we don't have the actual purchase deed for the island, but the infamous purchase, which in the 19th century, someone translated that 60 guilders into $24 and said, so then you have this whole story about the whole swindle of the island. Okay, quickly, just a couple of other examples. This is a document instructions from the directors of the West India Company in Amsterdam to Peter Stuyvesant, and this shows you there was a huge fire in the New York State Library in 1911. Most of the records were saved by the ironic fact that English records were seen to be more valuable, and so they were on top of them in the stacks. And then as the stacks collapsed, the English records actually preserved most of the Dutch records, but not all. And you can see the challenge that Charlie and Janni have had in dealing with these kinds of things. This is another document. One of the famous residents of the colony was a man named Anthony van Sale, who was a half Moroccan, half Dutch, sometimes pirate. And this document, the council is telling him that they have a right to take hay from him. I don't remember what infraction he committed. This is another document which is a deed for the purchase of Coney Island. And there's the guy, he's in the back of the room, Charlie Gehring. I'm putting a face to this effort of this work of translating and publishing and making available for scholars all these thousands of pages of records. And I go from one handsome devil to the next. This is James, the Duke of York. in 1664. So quick history of England in the 17th century. You have the English monarchy. Charles I is beheaded. There's this religious revival in England, this Puritanism. Oliver Cromwell becomes the head of the non-monarchic head of England for a time during the Civil Wars. And then the monarchy comes back. Charles II is king, and his brother, James, the Duke of York, the two of them in a small group conceived the idea. They say, okay, now we're back in power. What are we doing about America? What are we doing about the future? They want to ramp up. They want to really build an empire. They conceive this grand strategy, which is we're going to take over slave ports in West Africa. We're going to use ports in the Caribbean for slave bases. And then we're going to bring slaves into these North American colonies. And in North America, we've got this problematic situation. The New England colonies were founded by essentially Puritans. So they're kind of, we don't really trust them. We're the monarchy, and these are the people that, beheaded the king's predecessor. So we've got to deal with New England, we've got to deal with Virginia, and we've got this Dutch problem right in the middle. So James, the Duke of York, is kind of the mastermind behind this idea to take over the Dutch colony and then get the American colonies going on an English footing. Hold on one sec. So that's what they do. In 1664, the English take over the colony. New Amsterdam becomes New York after the Duke of York. His other title was the Duke of Albany, and so the Dutch city of Beverwijk, where Fort Orange was, upriver, becomes Albany. For a time, there was an effort to name New Jersey Albania, also after the Duke of Albany. And my little joke here is that there are a lot of New Yorkers who still think of New Jersey as Albania. But of course, a lot of place names stayed the same. Haarlem, Staten Island, Long Island. The whole topic is the persistence of Dutchness in the New York region well into the English period, in the 1700s, into the 1800s, and more recently than that even. And I'll just touch on that in a couple of quick images. My most recent book, which is sitting over there, is called Revolution Song, and that's about the American Revolution, and I wove together the lives of 6 people from that period to tell the story of the revolution from a different perspective. This man, Abraham Yates, is one of those 6 people who I focused on. He happens to be from Albany, so his life is basically the course of the 1700s. And when he was born, Albany was still, and for much of his life, Albany was still a very Dutch place. His father was English, his mother was Dutch. He grew up speaking Dutch. He was a shoemaker. This is his account book as a shoemaker. Still exists in the State Library in Albany. And so this is a page from it. And I'm just going to show you that this client in particular, Jacob Gerrits van Schijk, is Dutch. And you can see here he's out halve maan, half moon, which is up north of Albany. And you see the date, 1754, and you see here he made for him een paar schoenen voor je kind, 1 pair of shoes for your child. And then een paar mansschoenen, 1 pair of men's shoes. So he's actually, business is going on in Dutch in the 1750s still. So it's still a very Dutch place, as were a lot of other places in the Hudson Valley. This is Albany around 1800, looks like any Dutch town with the gables and so on. This is a slide of Sunnyside, Washington's Irving's home, which I'm just putting in there to quickly make reference to the kind of disinformation campaign about the Dutch period that Washington Irving ran, not necessarily purposely, but his Knickerbocker Tales he used the figures of the Dutch period as almost like cartoon characters. He makes them into little, so then in the American memory, you get this sense of the Dutch of the period being these kind of like little fat waddling figures with their long clay pipes, doing silly things and so on. So Washington Irving unintentionally creates this cartoon-like myth of what had happened under the Dutch in New Netherland that obscures what really happened, which is quite significant. This slide is meant to represent all of the little indications of the way that the Dutch colony permeates American culture. The Dutch Sinterklaas here becomes the American Santa Claus. Why do we eat cookies? Why don't we eat biscuits? That's the English word. The Dutch word is cookie. It still is. Coleslaw is, for better or worse, an American inheritance from the Dutch. So my favorite is the word boss, which comes into English in the 17th century from the Dutch baas, B-A-A-S. And what I like about it is, as it changes, there's the meaning changes. You know, in the 17th century, a boss was a master, like a master and apprentice, and as it shifts into English, it becomes you get this different sense. It's a different power relationship. But to me, all of these little tells to the Dutch influence are little. But what they really point to is this big influence, which is the two things that I'm talking about. This Dutch approach to free trade and the Dutch approach to tolerance. When you put those together, in New Amsterdam, in the 1640s, there were reported to be 18 languages being spoken. And then there were maybe only 500 or so people then. So New York was New York even before it was New York. Now, if you jump forward in time into the late 1800s, which is when this image of Lower Manhattan is done, then, and this again, right about here is New Amsterdam. This is landfill, mostly the park. This was the site of the fort, and that first, one of that early image is from here looking over at this side. You see this, by the late 19th century, you have this teeming place with all these people speaking different languages and worshiping different faiths and struggling to get ahead by what we would call upward mobility. And as people arrive here in great waves from Europe, they say, oh, this is America. It wasn't America, it was New York. But it became part of America thanks in large part to those people, those new arrivals who came here, experienced that, went across the river to New Jersey, kept going all the way west, and they brought that sense with them. So that's kind of my sense of how these things had started with the Dutch through their battles with water in the Middle Ages, develop there, and then they take on a different character in the Dutch colony, and then as time moves forward, it spreads in this very, very diffuse way. Do I have 5 or 10 more minutes, Neil, do you think? Okay, then I'm going to charge ahead into, I'm going to kind of shift gears here and talk about something which seems to be quite else, but it actually is not. This is the Florida Panhandle a couple weeks ago, the big storm whose name now I'm forgetting. Michael, yeah. And this is New Jersey, Hurricane Sandy. This is New York, Hurricane Sandy. This is Hurricane Hugo, I think it was, in Houston. 2 million cars destroyed because of flooding. This is not flooding, this is just Biscayne Bay in Miami, which by scientific projections, all this will be underwater sometime this century. I'm shifting to talk about climate change because it's a story about water, and the Dutch are the ones who are on top of it in the world. And why is that? It's because where I started, the Dutch, the whole coming into being of Dutch culture and the Dutch sensibility had to do with the struggle against water. So that's always been the case. Those slides I showed you of roads that were actually built on the top of a dike. Virtually every dike in the Netherlands, I mean, this is an act of constantly maintaining. All of those are computerized. So it's somebody in an office 100 miles away who's looking at a computer screen, and they can tell, okay, this dike is starting to deteriorate, we need to do X, Y. So they have really made a science out of dealing with water. And now we are all in the position of needing that kind of expertise. And while the Dutch are moving forward with that, I fear that in this country what we're doing is, we're in this like ideological struggle over the meaning and whether climate change exists and things like that. This is an example of not only a way the Dutch are dealing with climate change, but how they're changing their centuries-old thinking about it. This is the city of Nijmegen in the east of the Netherlands. This is the Waal River, and it comes from Germany here, makes this big bend, and then it goes out toward Rotterdam and the open water. Nijmegen is an ancient city, and then starting in the 1980s, it started flooding every spring. So that was kind of the canary in the coal mine for climate change. And they began this process of saying, okay, we can't, see, they had built up walls and dams of different sorts, but they weren't doing the job. So they started having these series of public meetings that took place over about 20 years to get people to start to change their thinking, their centuries-old thinking. All we do is build a dam, we build a dike, we build trenches. It wasn't going to work anymore. So they developed a number of new ideas, which they're still developing, and this one is called Room for the River. So the idea was, we're going to have to cut away some of our city and make more room for the river. So the idea was to cut a whole chunk out of the city, and they had to, again, over years and years of meetings, get the community to go to see this. So then this is what you get. Here is the piece they cut out. This is in the process of being transformed, and part of the year this is going to be underwater, this island. So this is one aspect of the Dutch approach. This is another innovation. This is called a sand motor, and the idea is scientifically you find strategic places where you're going to dump massive quantities of sand on the coast, and then you're going to let the ocean move it around to naturally form protective barriers. So they're experimenting with all of these innovative ways to deal with what's going on. And what I find fascinating about the Netherlands, living there for 6 years, is the way all aspects of society, local government, national government, corporations, NGOs, are kind of all tuned into this same notion of climate. Not only is climate change real, and not only is it a huge problem or a challenge, but it's an opportunity. We can make money from this. We can, and that's how. I mean, this goes back to that what I was talking about, that flipping the switch, and that we can innovate. We can do something with this. And the fear is that the U.S. doesn't have. I mean, there are lots of people who are aware of this. But it's a matter of everybody kind of being on the same page to get there. This slide, to me, shows the Dutch individual sense of innovation connected with the Dutch collectivism. Dealing with water requires the whole community together to be on the same page, to work together. This is how Dutch cities were built because the soil is unstable, so every house on those iconic canals needs to have piles way down below the sand, which are huge tree trunks. So these are pile drivers in the 17th century, and there's a tree trunk there, and they have an iron block on top, and they're each pulling a rope. And on the right there, you see a barrel. There's always a beer barrel in these pictures, and there are these chants that they sing, which are still, they still exist. So this, to me, shows that working together against, and this is another example of this Dutch kind of collaborative instinct, which I think is largely absent in this country. This is the SER, the Sociaal-Economische Raad, the Social Economic Council. It's comprised of leaders of government, corporate leaders, and union leaders. And on any big problem, immigration or pension reform or something, they all get together, come up with an agreement, advise the government. So it's like all parts of society kind of realizing we're in this struggle together, and it all goes back to, I think, to that to having to deal with water together. The polder model is the Dutch approach to this kind of building land, building a polder together, and it's a collaborative instinct. There are many manifestations of it. This is a map of every rail line in the Netherlands. The Netherlands, by American standards, a very small country. All these rail lines connect the country. These are every rail line in the U.S. If you look at Wyoming, it's, I think, about 5 times the size of the Netherlands. There's not one rail line. So, with this very different mentality in the U.S. This guy, his name was John Wilkes. He was an English leader in the 1700s who became hugely admired in America for his focus on individualism and individual freedom. People named children after him. Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania is named after him. They stopped naming children after him when John Wilkes Booth, kind of ruined the name. But John Wilkes represents this, what took hold in America, this myth of individual freedom. And that becomes, I think, to me, it's the American cowboy. That's the American myth, which is truly a myth. I mean, there's something to it, but it's truly a myth. The Lone Ranger, he's alone. He does it alone, against that slide I just showed you of the collaborative instinct. I'm going to quickly move past that. So when it comes to climate change, this myth of the individual completely breaks down. You have to deal with it collaboratively. This is Henk Ovink, who was the head of Dutch water management, who, after Hurricane Sandy, was brought in by the federal government to create a task force in this country to figure out ways to bring some of that Dutch thinking to an American context. And he's put together this team. He's now all over the world, but I wrote a profile of him for the New York Times Magazine, and he had the idea to get in a swimming pool for this, so he has a sense of humor too. So I'm going to end by saying that there are hopeful signs, and one of the projects that he was involved with in the U.S., this is Hoboken. This is an artist's rendering. Hoboken's been very aggressive at trying to figure out ways to deal with water in the future and flooding. This little park you see is kind of copied from Rotterdam and other places in the Netherlands. You create a park or a playground, but it's below the level of the city. And you've got water lines underground, like sewers, so whenever there's a serious storm or something, all of that drains so your city isn't flooded, your cars aren't destroyed. So there's a whole combination of factors involved in trying to battle something like this. Lower Manhattan, this is also part of the design of Rebuild by Design is the name of this project that Henk Ovink spearheaded. And this is protecting Lower Manhattan. This is what is in progress now. These are again, lots and lots of community meetings and things. Combination of natural barriers and old-fashioned walls and things like that. So that somehow through the mystery of time starts here. I began by talking about the acorn and the oak, and this to me truly is the flow of influence. It really is all about water, and somehow it remains, to me anyway, the island at the center of the world. Thank you. Thank you.
We have no time for questions now, and Mr. Shorto is willing to answer
Sure.
questions. But I'd like to ask anybody with a question to step forward to the mic because we are live taping. All of that on the tape.
Or if you don't want to, I can also repeat questions here. So. Hi.
I don't want to dominate the whole room. Do you think that the Dutch government in Amsterdam would have fought for the municipality and the colony more if the population of New Netherland wasn't so diverse and non-Dutch? There were Walloons and Jews and the Africans and the slaves. Do you think if it was a more homogeneous population that the Republic would have fought for it a little bit more?
I'm not sure if that mic was on, so he asked if, I'll repeat it. He asked if the Dutch Republic would have fought harder to defend the colony from the English if the population was more pure, more purely Dutch and not such a diverse. I don't think so. I think their attention was focused on places where they were really making money, which is the East Indies. This is the West Indies, and it was always troublesome, and it was minor. I mean, it's hard to think of it now, but this was minor to them compared to other parts of the world. And I think that was the problem that Van der Donck and others had. They were trying desperately to say, Van der Donck was saying to people, he goes back to the Netherlands and makes this plea to the States General, the governing body, and says, look, we've got this colony that sits astride this continent that is so vast, we don't even know how big it is. And someday it's going to rise to outstrip the mother country in power. And he actually says, if you don't protect it, it's going to happen under the English, because they'll eventually take over. So he kind of foresees the next, turn of history. So I think it was that rather than, them having kind of this prejudice about that, which is not to say that they didn't have prejudice. But. And yes.
I was just curious to know if the translating is still going on, because I remember there were thousands, or how many thousands of documents and boxes, and it's been 30 years that he's been doing that Charles has been doing the translating.
I feel like that Marshall McLuhan moment in the Woody Allen movie, because he's here. Charlie Gehring and Yanni Venema, the translators, are here, and they're going to be speaking at, I think, 3 o'clock. But yeah, it's still going on. They have finished transcribing all the, you make a copy of what it says and where all the gaps are, if it's been burned or eaten by rats or something. And then you work from that to make a translation. And so they finished all the transcribing, and now they'll address this later today, but something like maybe 75% of it is done, so there's still a good chunk remaining, but they can talk more about that later. Oh, one more.
So I really don't have a question, but I just wanted to make a comment, because being, somewhat educated, having advanced degrees and such, I feel like somehow in my learning and history, I totally missed this whole thing about the Dutch. And we learned so much about the English effect on New York. And so I just wanted to say thank you for your book. Our book club chose to read it. And you mentioned about in narrative history about wanting to place the reader right there. And I felt so much like I was right there. And I was rooting for Van der Donck. I really wanted him to be successful. And, that Stuyvesant, he was just the villain in some ways. But anyway, I just wanted to say thank you so much for giving us this other view, and for having us appreciate more the Dutch and what they've done. Just recently, my husband and I were in Venice, and of course, like the pictures that you showed, so many places in the world are struggling with water. And Venice, we were in St. Mark's Square, and they have platforms that they erect several times a year so that you can walk, because of the fact that the water just invades. And so on one of our tours, my husband said, why not contact the Dutch? They're so familiar with this problem. But anyway, I just wanted to say thank you so much for furthering my education.
Well, thank you for that, but it's really, again, the group at the New Netherland Institute and their work, that's the material. And then people like me come along and figure out ways to use that, and that's the way history works. You've got the primary sources, and then you develop secondary sources, and you hope slowly that that awareness builds.